travel. What does it mean to travel? Should we travel? How should we travel? When should we travel? Where should we travel to? Unless you're currently living in the same place where you were born, you're living in the same city, you're living in the same home, you've experienced some form of travel. You visited a city, maybe a weekend trip, a week-long trip. Maybe you've been on a missions trip. Maybe you've studied abroad as a student. You spent a semester abroad. You've experienced travel in some way. Uh, Maybe you want to travel somewhere. Where do you want to travel to? If I were to give you a ticket right now, a blank ticket, and you could travel anywhere you wanted to, anywhere in the world, where would you go? That question, of course, is conditioned because it's a free ticket. And so maybe you would choose a place that's a little bit more expensive to get to, like the Maldives or maybe New Zealand. But the question is a good question. Why would you want to go to this place? There's a country that you have in mind. When I said, when I asked you, where do you want to travel to? A country popped in your mind. Why that country? Maybe you read something, maybe a friend traveled there, you saw a movie, and this is the country that you want to go to and experience firsthand. For me, it was Burma. Many, many years ago, I read a guidebook, and there was this description of Burma, Myanmar, and I absolutely fell in love with this country. I needed to go visit this country. I have made travel a habit. I've traveled extensively throughout my entire life. I grew up in Spain, and so anytime I went anywhere in Europe, I had to travel through France. I've been to France more times than I care to remember. My parents, there was a conference that they had to go to every single year. And what they did was they combined their vacation with this conference. And so we would spend 3 to 4 weeks in a van traveling to numerous countries like Belgium, Switzerland, Austria. One of my earliest memories is a vacation we took to Austria. My mother was obsessed with the sound of music. And so we had to visit all of the locations where it was filmed, the house, the church, the fountain, the streets, when the little passageway where they went on their little bicycles. I don't know if you've seen the film, but we had to recreate that scene as well. We rented bicycles, my siblings and I, and we took pictures. This is one of the earliest trips that I remember. So I grew up loving to travel, enjoying it tremendously. My father built kind of a structure in the back of the van with the luggage went underneath, and us kids, we would sleep on top of it. And this is how they got away with not staying at hotels. We would drive through the night. Now that I have children, I recognize that it wasn't just a cost-saving technique, but it was also a way to drive in peace so that you can drive through all the fighting, or you can avoid the fighting, as it were. So I have traveled extensively. I've been to approximately 45 to 50 countries. It's difficult to come up with a list because what does it mean to travel to a country? Does it count? Of course, layovers don't count. Does it count if you kind of cross the border? For instance, when I was in Brazil, I crossed the border and had lunch in Colombia. Can I say that I've been to Colombia? Or what do you do with places like Andorra or Taiwan? Is Taiwan a country? Or what do you do with Hong Kong, Macau, etc.? But 45 to 50, I'll say, locations, right? And I've traveled in a number of different capacities. I've been a tourist. I've been a kind of a voyager, I suppose, a traveler. I've studied abroad as a student. I've led students to a number of different programs in Spain and Portugal and Morocco. I've been to some countries for conferences, on business trips. I spent a week translating in Cuba. Just a number of different capacities. I thoroughly enjoy traveling, and I will continue to travel. At the top of my list right now is going to Patagonia. I cannot believe that, as old as I am, I have not been to Patagonia. So what does it mean to travel? The text that you're reading this week, Travel as Metaphor, you're reading the introduction by Van den Abeli. It's going to give us a number of terms, of concepts, ideas, things that we're going to use throughout the semester. Van den Abeli talks about categories of loss and gain in regards to tourism or cultural experiences. Whether the voyage is loss or gain, what's important or what's at stake is that there's a property, something that can be lost or something that can be gained. And Van den Abeli uses the term the economy of travel. And that's what we're going to use throughout the semester, the economy of travel. And the economy of travel requires a fixed point. It requires a point, and this point he calls oikos. And oikos, we're going to use extensively throughout the semester, throughout this course, is what locates everything that happens. It's going to, the oikos acts as a transcendental point of reference that organizes and domesticates a given area by defining the other points entirely in relation to this oikos. Okay, so think of it as, you can think of it as home, but that might be a little bit problematic because it's not exactly or entirely your home. It's the point, it's where everything gets compared to. Okay, so if you think about when you first went to college, for instance, and you left your home, that was your oikos. And so everything that happened at your university, at the college, in your courses, in your dorm, you were kind of comparing to your home. Think about the first time you had a meal at a restaurant in the new location or at the dining commons. You probably made a comment about how it compared to your home, how it compared to your mother's cooking, for instance, right? And it's interesting too because the oikos tends to not change in your mind, right? So when you're thinking about your home, when you go off to college, nothing's changed, right? Of course, things are happening back home, but in your mind, nothing is changing. This is what happens. This is the traumatic experience when you go back home and your parents have turned your bedroom into, I don't know, a workroom, or your brother has taken over your room, right? This has not happened in your mind. And when you go back, all of a sudden, everything gets thrown off. You know, how could you do this? Everything was supposed to stay the same. My friends, of course, they didn't meet anybody else. The girlfriend that I had, we're still dating, or, maybe not. But this is the oikos. And what's important about the oikos is that it can change. So little by little, what happens is when you move away from your oikos, this starts to become your new oikos. And now everything else that happens around it, now you start comparing to your new oikos. That's why it can be a little problematic to think of oikos as home. Another important note with oikos is that the very activity of travel is going to displace it. It's going to displace the oikos. I want to move now to the other reading for this week, which comes from James Clifford in a book called Routes, Travel and Translation in the 20th Century. And we're reading the first chapter called Traveling Cultures. Really, they're lectures that he gave. James Clifford is a historian, an anthropologist, really an interdisciplinary scholar. And he wrote extensively on travel, on interpreting texts that dealt with traveling. And I love the way he starts because he has numerous beginnings. There are all kinds of different ways. We can start here, or we can start here, or we can look at this text. But they all have one thing in common, which is the hotel. And what I want you to think about is, where does travel take place? Where does it occur? For many of us, travel, when we think about where we're going to travel to, we think about famous landscapes. We think about maybe the Eiffel Tower. I'm going to go to Paris and I'm going to see the Eiffel Tower. I'm going to go to India and I'm going to go look at and gaze upon the Taj Mahal, for instance. I'm going to go to Peru and I'm going to go to Machu Picchu. I'm going to see Machu Picchu. But where does travel actually take place? Where does it actually occur? And one of the things that I'm going to come back to time and time again is that traveling doesn't really occur in these places. It occurs with the people that you meet. It occurs with what Clifford calls the informants, right? But before we get to that, I want to mention briefly too that of course these places are important. Of course, go to the Eiffel Tower and take your picture and so forth. Of course, right? We all want to experience that firsthand. But I want to mention briefly that traveling, there's a term, adventure, right, that gets used quite often. And a quote that I like to use in my classes when I talk to people, it's a quote by Ivan Shoyanard. And it's a beautiful, wonderful quote because according to him, and I agree with him, the term adventure is misused or overused, right? We're going to have an adventure. We're going to go somewhere. And I want to quote Ivan Shoyanard. Ivan Shoyanard, he was, of course, the founder of Patagonia, an adventurer extraordinaire. He's climbed all kinds of mountains, and he wrote a great book called Let My People Go Surfing that I highly recommend. But he's featured in a film called 180 Degrees South, a movie I think in 2010 it came out, another movie that I recommend. And this is the quote: "The word adventure has just gotten overused. For me, adventure is when everything goes wrong. That's when the adventure starts." And so I want you to think about that too as you prepare to travel, as you think about what's going to happen. Yes, you're going to take your picture of the Eiffel Tower, but The adventure, it's really when something goes wrong. The bus breaks down, or you miss a connecting flight, etc. That's when the adventure really begins. Things are much more prescribed right now. They're much more controlled. There's a lot more information, of course, Yelp reviews. Recently, I was preparing to I was going to lead some trips on a study abroad trip, and I was a bit surprised, a bit taken aback at how much information my students needed before we went on this trip. They wanted the pictures of the hotel, they wanted the location, how close is it, what can we do? Everything needed to be prescribed or kind of outlined or predetermined. And there's a level of improvisation that I think is also necessary when you travel. It's okay to have things planned out, where you're going to go and so forth, but you also need to leave room for some improvisation, right? And that's where, of course, the adventure can take place. And this is where you're going to meet people. So to return to Clifford, he begins with what he calls the Squanto Effect. Squanto, of course, was the Patuxet, a Native American who met the Pilgrims when they arrived in 1620. Squanto had been kidnapped, had been taken to Spain, where he was again sold, and he ends up in England, learns English, ends up back in his native tribe in 1619. And this is where he lives with the Pilgrims for about 2 to 3 years, and he dies in 1622. And he becomes kind of the translator. He tries to help with peace talks, etc. And so the Squanto for Clifford becomes a figure, an informant, right? This is the figure who is introducing the Pilgrims to the new world, as it were. And these are the kinds of people that you're going to encounter as well when you travel. You're going to encounter people, what you're going to call locals, who have traveled, who have learned English, perhaps, and us as participant observers. We need to be aware of this, of course. We need to be aware of how the culture is being localized, how the culture is being expressed. Where is the culture being centered? Is it being centered around a village, around the capital, around the place where this person lived and grew up, etc.? These are things that we need to keep in mind. Clifford Geertz is another important anthropologist. He noted for his work on symbols. He has a great quote on culture. I'm going to pause for a second to bring you this quote because I think it's excellent. This is the quote: "Culture is a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes toward life." And so the function of culture then is a way of imposing meaning on the world or understanding the meaning of the world. That's what culture is to him. But Geertz, he draws an important distinction between studying villages and studying in a village. And that's an important distinction because often when we travel, we think we're studying, say if we're in Madrid, we think we're studying Madrid, but really what we're doing is we're just studying in Madrid. And that's an important distinction. So the field, right, this field, it can be confused with culture. And there are also a number of other complications. Think of the language barriers that occur. Unless you're traveling to a country that speaks the language that you speak, you're gonna encounter these difficulties. How do I communicate with other people? I insist you must learn some of the language. Learn as much as you possibly can anywhere you go. I don't care for how long, if it's 5 days or if it's 5 months or 5 years, you need to learn the language. Make an effort to learn the language. Absolutely. But there's going to be complications with that, right? There's certain nuances, and for all kinds of terms and things that you're not gonna get right away that require time, right? You need to live in these countries in order to fully understand how to communicate. So understand those limitations as well. I remember in Ethiopia, for instance, when I spent about 3 weeks there, and I learned how to say a couple of phrases. I learned how to say, of course, hello, how are you? Where's the bathroom? And other phrases that are necessary for existence, right? But I also learned how to say a phrase, which was, stay away from her, she's my wife. This is a phrase that I learned, and this is very much my sense of humor. This is kind of who I am. And so I was traveling. She wasn't my wife at the time. I ended up actually proposing to her in Ethiopia, but it was easier for the sake of conversation and communication just to say that she was my wife. And so we'd meet people, and I would say, hello, how are you, et cetera, get as far as I could. And then I would turn to my future wife and say, Stay away from her, she's my wife. And immediately they would start laughing, and there was this immediate connection and just one step further, right? And it allowed for all kinds of contact with these informants, as Clifford calls them, or people, right, all over the country. And it was great. So I recommend that you also do the same. Learn as much as you can, but also, learn some phrases that go along with your personality, right? To try to get past those first couple of kind of introductory phrases. So Clifford encourages us to look at hybrid cosmopolitan experiences as much as on the rooted native ones. And this gets into a definition or concept of culture that is typically seen as kind of this thing that never changes, that never kind of evolves, right? It's rooted body that grows, lives, and then dies. And that's not the case. It's not the case at all. Some years ago, there was a conference in Europe, and many authors, academics, scholars from South America were going to come to this conference. And the organizers of the conference encouraged people to come dressed in their local garb. Come in your traditional clothes. Well, there was an Argentine author who showed up in jeans, a Nike T-shirt, and I think it was a New York Yankees baseball cap. I kind of looked at him like, what are you doing? You're supposed to come dressed in your traditional garb. And his response was, this is how we dress. This is my culture. This is what we do, what we do now. And so it's important to understand that, of course, culture, it's going to change. It changes, it fluctuates. Of course, that's okay. I want to turn now to an ethnography by Smadar Levy. And it's an extensive quote, but I think this is important for us to understand. This ethnography, it shows the Bedouins in southern Sinai. Of course, southern Sinai had been traversed by all sorts of people, right? And in this ethnography, what you can hear people telling stories, they're making jokes, they're laughing about the tourists and so forth. And then all of a sudden you can hear in the radio, the crackling, the news is about to come on. And one of the Bedouins, he kind of turns the radio off and he says, I can tell you what's going to happen, right? And this is the comment that's made. The Greeks were here and left behind the monastery. The Turks were here and left behind the castle. And the British drew up maps, and the Egyptians brought the Russian army and a few oil wells. And the Israelis brought the Americans who made the mountains into movies, and tourists from France and Japan, and scuba divers from Sweden and Australia, and trust Allah to save you from the devil. We, Mzena, are nothing but pawns in the hands of them all. We are like pebbles and the droppings of the Shiza. Everyone laughs. The coordinator then points to me with his long index finger, saying in a commanding voice, write it all down, the one who writes us. The one who writes us, this is an important concept because in many ways when you travel, you're going to be the one who writes them. This sets up an interesting dichotomy, us versus them. Who are we to write about them? How are we going to write them? And of course, right now, there's all kinds of platforms, right? Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and any number of social media that you're going to use to kind of tell your story, to talk about your experience, right? And I urge you to take that seriously. Edward Said, he was one of the founders of the academic discipline called post-colonial studies. And he wrote a book called Orientalism. Highly recommend this book. And there are a number of definitions for what Orientalism is, but I want to focus on this one in particular. This is the definition. Orientalism is the representation of Asia, especially the Middle East, in a stereotyped way that is regarded as embodying a colonialist attitude. So Orientalism has been used for a number of purposes, to go to war, to kind of create this us versus them. But what's important to note about Edward Said is that he was studying texts that had been written by British colonizers, right? And he's studying all these texts that they'd written about all the places and areas and countries that they'd colonized, Burma, India, and so forth. And he recognizes or kind of notes that they all look the same. And they all do the same thing, and there's a kind of a stereotyped unity among them all. And he kind of questions this: how can this be that these people who are so different are kind of cast in this very sort of same light, right? And so he concludes that when they're writing about these other people, they're saying less about them than they are about themselves. This is their representation of this other. And so I want you to consider this when you travel. When you make these distinctions between us and them, Are you really talking about them, or are you talking about yourself and your interpretation of them? So there's an interesting distinction in Clifford when he distinguishes between sort of good travel, positive travel, and negative travel. Negative, and of course, he's interpreting texts that are written or travel narration. Negative travel, transient superficiality, tourism, exile, rootlessness, and then contrasted with the positive, which is exploration, research, escape, transforming encounter. This is sort of the Bildungsroman, right? You have a transforming experience when you travel that makes you a better person or helps you understand more deeply some things. So we need to rethink culture. We need to rethink culture as sites of dwelling and travel. And we need to take travel knowledge seriously. Good travel, he returns to this sort of heroic, educational, scientific, adventurous, ennobling. These are the descriptions, right? And so then he returns to the hotel as a place where travel takes place, where it occurs. And this is not surprising. You think about old texts, think about, for instance, Boccaccio, the Decameron, or think about Canterbury Tales, or Don Quixote, where you have these sort of travelers and they all kind of meet in one place and then they kind of tell their stories. And this is what's going to happen when you travel as well. I remember when I was in Brazil, I was at a hostel in Salvador, and I loved the experience because in this hostel there was a woman from Israel, there was this German couple that was there, and of course New Zealanders. You're always going to encounter New Zealanders wherever you go. They're traveling all the time. And it was this really cool experience of walking around the streets of Salvador in Brazil with this very eclectic, very this varied group of people. And I encourage you to think of that as travel as well. That's where travel occurs. But there's also kind of travel that avoids the hotels, that is going to sort of pass by them, right? There was a trip I took around Europe for 2 months, and we stayed in 3 hotels the entire time. It was very much a sleeping under bridges and in bushes and so forth. And the contact was different, right? You didn't have these places, these locations where you could encounter people, right? But just as valid and important. And lastly, I want to leave you with this. There's a kind of telling of stories in traveling, and this might happen with you as well, that's going to exclude certain people. Clifford talks about, servants and helpers, companions, guides, etc., that are somehow or for some reason left out of the narrative. Think about the first person who ever climbed Mount Everest. Well, the first confirmed ascent of Mount Everest. You know his name, I think, Sir Edmund Hillary. But do you know, and of course, I understand there's some kind of, there's a controversy. Did George Mallory make it to the top or not? Okay, we're going to leave that to the side. The first confirmed summit of Mount Everest was Sir Edmund Hillary. But do you know, he wasn't alone. Who did he go up with? Tenzing Norgay, he was a Sherpa. But often when we recount the story of the first sort of heroic ascent of Mount Everest, we leave Tenzing Norgay out, and it was Sir Edmund Hillary, right, who made it to the top. So I would encourage you to think about that when you tell your story, when you write about them, right? The travel, by definition, is someone who has a security and privilege to move about in a relatively unconstrained way. And we'd have to unpack that. It would take too long to unpack, but it does come from a place of privilege, the kind of travel that we're talking about. Of course, there's a whole other discussion on travel, refugees, etc. Right? That's a different day. But for now, we're talking about travel. We're talking about the kind of travel that comes with privilege. And I want you to think about too, when you travel, that it often occurs in highly determined circuits. So this occurs when you travel to a country and you get a sense of this is what everybody does. You kind of go along this path. Or when I was in Vietnam, for instance, we bought bus passes and we kind of went up the coast of Vietnam, and these bus passes, you could get off whenever you wanted, get back on, and so you visit these cities. But the sense I got was, every time you got off this bus, they're the same group of people or similar group of people who would then take you to the hotel, who would then take you to the location, and then back to the hotel, back to the bus. And yeah, you're experiencing the country, you're experiencing the culture, but maybe in a very prescribed, kind of highly determined circuit. And so when I think I was in Da Nang, I can't remember exactly what city it was, but we were walking down the street and a guy showed up and said, "Hey, do you want to ride motorcycles on the Ho Chi Minh Trail?" And I said, yes, I would like to ride motorcycles on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So we were able to kind of get off this highly determined circuit and go off on our own for 4 days on motorcycles. One of my favorite experiences for sure. But even that could be seen as a highly determined circuit. Even that is somebody kind of an informant, as it were, taking me along, understanding what I wanted at the moment, and kind of in the same highly determined circuit, but slightly different, maybe slightly more adventurous. So lastly, the cultural comparison. This is extremely important. When you travel, you're gonna have ideas, preconceived notions of what it means to travel, what it means to visit, what it means to eat at a restaurant. I have a theory, an unconfirmed theory, right? I have no studies. I have not done an official study of this, but I have an idea that, as you know, as I'm sure you know, North Americans, they don't have the greatest reputation when they travel to foreign countries. If you didn't know this, now you know. And I think that the reason is because the United States is incredible at customer service. This is probably the best country in terms of customer service, okay? You grow up with the client is always right. You can return things forever, it seems like. Free refills at restaurants. When you go to a restaurant, and you ask for a steak, how do you want your your steak cooked? What shape would you like it in? French fries? What dipping sauce? What kind of? Like, all these, everything is catered exactly to your smallest need. This doesn't occur in many countries where you travel. And even the service you receive, right? You take a sip of water and immediately the waiter comes over and he's like refilling the server comes over and is refilling the glass as you're drinking, because heaven forbid your glass should get to half full, right? This doesn't really occur in many countries. And so if you grow up with this idea and then you go to a foreign country and you're sitting in a restaurant and your glass runs out of water and they don't come refill it, that's where you get these scenarios or the situations where people get upset. So you need to keep these things in mind when you travel. And also, for instance, when we go to a restaurant in Spain, I always tell my students that it's going to take you a while to get the bill. They're not going to come. They're going to let you sit there, and whenever you're ready to leave, you raise your hand, you go get the bill. So keep these things in mind when you think about cultural comparisons. Of course, not better or worse, just different, but you need to go in with that humble mentality.